stand on the recommendations? Who should be getting these booster shots?
Well, look, I think there's clear evidence for people over the age of 60, and you can make an argument for over the age of 50, that there is declining efficacy over time. This is coming out of the Israeli data set. You're seeing rising incidences of breakthrough infections and some evidence pointing to rising incidences of severe infections in that population. So there's clear clinical evidence that they could be benefiting from boosters. I think where public health officials are a little bit more split is below the age of 50. I think there's generally agreement that people who are at risk of COVID because of underlying health conditions probably could be benefiting from boosters. And in the question that the CDC struggled with, where the CDC director ultimately weighed in, is people who are otherwise younger and healthier, but at significant risk of contracting COVID because of occupational exposures. The CDC director's decision wasn't really a repudiation of the advice from her advisory committee. The advisory committee itself was very split on that question. The vote was 6-9. And the dialogue was very split. And so the CDC director does get a vote in this case, and she ultimately aligned with where the FDA came out in terms of offering broader eligibility for boosters for people based on occupational exposures as well. I think at the end of the day, where the CDC came out on this is with a framework that will be easier to implement. I think we also need to maintain an eye towards what can be implemented at the point of care. And if we come up with an overly complex regimen that's hard to implement, it's ultimately going to create obstacles to access, many times for people who already face significant obstacles getting access to care.
I guess when you look at the science of it and the data, and if it shows that immunity does wane over time, doesn't it wane for 30-year-olds just like it does for 65-year-olds? Is it just that if you're 65 and have an underlying condition, you may be more likely to suffer from severe disease or hospitalization? Are there not enough vaccines for anyone that wants one to get a booster?
I don't think it's a question of supply. A lot of public health officials want to see the data. They actually want to see evidence of declining efficacy that's translating into worsening health outcomes for that younger age set. You could postulate that the immunity is declining in an older population because they don't have as robust immune response initially to the vaccines, and you won't see as pronounced a decline in a younger population. You can also postulate that the residual immunity, even if there is a decline in immune protection across the age continuum, the residual immunity that a younger person would maintain is going to provide more protective value than it would in an older individual. So that's why there's debate within the public health community around this question. I think the challenge is that you have two agencies, FDA and CDC, with very distinct mandates, and they're looking at the same question through a different lens. And that's why you often see this divergence between the two agencies. This is not uncommon. It's often the case that FDA will have a broader authorization around vaccines and CDC will narrow it. Now, typically, CDC's role is in providing for recommendations around the childhood immunization schedule, the pediatric vaccines. And you want that to be a very sequential, deliberative, arguably slow process. If we're going to mandate a vaccine for children across the country, you want the process to be very deliberative. I think a process that's designed to be very deliberative, to have divergence by the nature of the structure of the process between the two agencies, superimposing that process on trying to make recommendations around a vaccine in a fast-moving pandemic where you're providing for adult vaccinations that are discretionary, where adults have discretion whether they take the vaccine or not. This may not be the best process for that. We may have been better off trying to design a different approach, getting CDC and FDA aligned from the outset and having one seamless process rather than this sort of disjointed approach where you have FDA and CDC rendering different verdicts, especially if you want to inspire public confidence and you really don't want to create the perception that there's disputes between organizations, because that's going to get exploited by people who want to sow doubt.